Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
No moderate Islam. There is no version of Islam that does not teach warfare against unbelievers and their subjugation.
Hello, beautiful woman, come with me. Come on, I'll give you 10 camels for the woman. Come with me.
15 to 25% are radicalized. Now, not every single one of them wants to blow himself up, but they either support terrorists who want to blow themselves up, provide them with financing, provide them for money, provide them with logistical support. 15 to 25%.
They should be aware that America, even though America has its own problems, could be the last man standing, because Europe, if not already lost, is almost lost to this terrible fascist ideology called Islam.
This is a spiritual warfare, and what we need to do is defeat Islamic Jihad. Sadly, our president has the wrong prescription. He even fails to acknowledge their motivations for bringing about jihad. Yes, Mr. President, it is about Islam.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam Sayyidina Muhammadin alihi tayyibin tahirin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I read a recent article in the Washington Post about a mosque in Boca Raton, Florida. Last week, the county commissioner had decided to remove it as a vote place that you could go and vote in the upcoming election. Of course, they were asked what the reason was, and what the county commissioner said was that they were receiving a lot of complaints, primarily anonymous complaints from people who claimed to live in the area, who didn't feel comfortable going to a mosque to vote, and so it was removed from the list. The main reason that I was questioning this is because it's strange to me that this site had been used for years. People have been voting there for years in other elections. Nobody had complained, and then suddenly, sort of kind of out of the blue, not anything that anyone at the mosque did or anything physically having to do with the mosque changed. However, the attitudes of the people in the area dramatically changed. So I just thought that was very disturbing and wanted to go a little bit deeper into this topic of Islamophobia, especially, again, given the recent events that have occurred in the United States. So the first question is, what is Islamophobia? The idea originally of Islamophobia, interestingly enough, does not come from the United States. It actually comes from Britain. The term was coined or defined as a concept actually in 1991. There was something called the Runnymede Trust Report, and it identified at that time in 1991, which is interesting, 10 years before September 11th, they identified an unfounded hostility towards Muslims and therefore a fear or dislike of almost all Muslims. That's a direct quote from the report. Of course, there's been many studies since then that have come out documenting this phenomenon. So first of all, Islamophobia, I would argue Islamophobia does exist. It is a real thing, and would define it as an irrational fear or prejudice of Islam or Muslims. Somebody who lives next to an unpleasant or a dangerous or a psychotic person that happens to be a Muslim, of course, in that case, the fear of that person is not irrational. Of course, it doesn't have anything to do with Islam in general. It's specific to that person. But an irrational fear is a fear of someone because they're a Muslim or because they practice Islam with no basis. There's no basis for you to be afraid of that person. The person themselves has not done anything to make you afraid, but yet you have this irrational fear of them, right? And it's much more common in the United States for this fear to be directed towards people, towards Muslims. Maybe the most important question, or one of the most important questions we'll ask, though, is not whether it exists or what is it, but specifically where does it come from? Because Islamophobia is thought of in general in the culture as something that is a widely dispersed phenomenon. So the irrational fear or prejudice against Muslims in the United States is commonly thought to exist broadly in the culture, which is not the case. As someone who is a Muslim here, who's been in the Muslim community for a long time in the United States, who has lots of family in the United States that are Muslim, that generally speaking in the United States, most people that you meet that are non-Muslim and that know you're a Muslim will not react towards you in a hostile way, you will not experience prejudice from them. The vast majority of the people are accepting of Muslims and of Islam in general. It's a relatively small minority in the United States that is basically motivated to have this irrational fear or prejudice. And the origin of this irrational fear or prejudice, of course, does not exist within Islam itself. It's actually there's a very specific and small group of people in the United States that work very hard, that expend a lot of money and energy to spread Islamophobia within the United States. They essentially create misinformation about Islam. And the misinformation that they create about Islam has some very specific characteristics. It displays Islam and Muslims as monolithic, presents Islamic culture as barbaric, violent, and savage, promote what's called the clash of civilizations narrative. They project the West or the modern Western non-Muslim countries as monolithic, as homogeneous, essentially white, Christian, Protestant, that it's in a clash with the Islamic civilization, which is Arab, savage, violent, all of these stereotypes that you see in the worst movies where Muslims are the villains or whatever. They basically project that as representing Islamic culture, and that the modern civilized Western man versus the barbaric savage Muslim, their main reason for spreading this misinformation is that they claim that Muslims in the U.S. are actively trying to essentially infiltrate the society and to impose Islamic law on non-Muslims, to impose the values and culture of Islam onto non-Muslims in the United States. This is their claim. This is the main thing that they say that they're trying to prevent, right? Specifically, the way that it works is they take any type of a violent or cruel or barbaric incident that occurs anywhere in the world that the person who commits it claims to be Muslim. So obviously there's lots of examples of this. Recently the most common examples, of course, are terrorist acts, but there's others, genital mutilation, destruction of churches, etc. Whenever they find anybody who claims Islam as their religion and commits these actions, they try very hard to use this to characterize all Muslims or to characterize the entire religion of Islam. So it's like creating a caricature or a cartoon version of what Islam is, and then they essentially sell this caricature of Islam and try to convince people that this is what Islam is. This group of people who does this, it's a very specific group of people in the United States, and again, we will give some specific examples throughout the video of who exactly we're talking about. But essentially, the money comes from a relatively small group of wealthy donors, and this money goes to primarily pseudo-scholars and anti-Muslim activists, people who are actively engaged in spreading this misinformation. This misinformation is generally picked up both by right-wing U.S. politicians in the United States, and also right-wing media organizations pick up this misinformation that's spread. Another group that also is actively engaged in spreading misinformation about Islam are fake ex-Muslims, people who claim to have been Muslim and converted to Christianity, primarily Christianity. They do this because they think that they'll have more credibility being an ex-Muslim, that they somehow know more about Islam because they were raised in a Muslim family, or who knows. The result of Islamophobia in the United States is not only that certain people who are afraid and fearful of Muslims vote for people, politicians, because they think that they'll protect them, or watch right-wing media news outlets because they think somehow that information is going to help them to be more safe, or whatever the case may be. The result of it is also that there's many, many, many Islamophobic incidents that occur that endanger the lives of Muslims in the United States. So there's been a dramatic rise since 2015, a dramatic rise in anti-Muslim hate attacks And of course, this results in, loss of life, loss of freedom, injury, sometimes death. It also leads to lots of misunderstandings between Muslims and non-Muslims. And a lot of this lately has been fueled by the rise of Islamophobic demagogues, like Donald Trump is a prime example of that, who essentially encourage hate and prejudice, and they make people fearful. And so, of course, when people are in that mindset, then they're much more likely to, lash out at people that they think are a threat, which are Muslims. And that's, of course, the most tragic part of them. The main reason that I'm even talking about this or doing this video is primarily because of that, because the hate and the prejudice and the fear, irrational fear, is on the rise. And that's what we need to stop. Muslims in the United States in general are not trying to impose Sharia law on non-Muslims. They're not trying to impose anything on non-Muslims. In fact, they're such a small group that it would pretty much, and we've covered this in other videos, it'd be pretty much impossible for them to do that anyway. But primarily what Muslims are asking, and the reason that they're concerned about Islamophobia and why they want it to stop, is just to protect themselves essentially, and to not constantly be the victim of prejudice, discrimination, violence, hatred. It's just a question of, protecting ourselves. How do Muslims themselves contribute to this problem? The main reason that Islamophobia exists in the country primarily is because Muslims in the United States are a small minority, so they're only about maybe 1% of the population currently. Of course, there's much that's being made, obviously, all the time about it's the fastest growing religion, etc. But, as of today, August of 2016, the Muslim population of the United States is only about 1%. There's anywhere from 3 to 5 million, depending on which surveys you believe, and they're not really very reliable as far as the exact number. People in the United States in general have little to no interaction with Muslims themselves, and they know almost nothing about Islam other than the stories that they see on the news about terrorist attacks and other things that are always attributed to Muslims, other than those very negative news stories, and they don't interact with Muslims on a regular basis. Most of the images that they see of Muslims in the popular media are primarily negative. So I guess in that sense, that almost by itself would kind of predispose someone to have a negative image of Islam, right? So even without the active spread of misinformation by these Islamophobia networks, that tendency would still be there. Most Muslims in the United States, something like I think 67% from the last statistics, are first-generation Americans, so they're immigrants to the country. They primarily came here as economic migrants. Of course, there were some that came as refugees fleeing political conflict, but the vast majority of Muslims in the United States are here for economic reasons. They're economic migrants. They want to improve the economic situation of themselves and their families, and a lot of times, lots of extended family back home. The mosques and Islamic centers in the United States cater primarily to the immigrant Americans or immigrants. So they cater to that. So the mosques and Islamic centers are primarily focused on preserving their religious and cultural identity that they brought from whatever country they're from, rather than spreading the message of Islam in the wider society, or having a dialogue or talking to their neighbors, friends and neighbors in the area about Islam and what it is. So the mosques, unfortunately, they tend to isolate people within little ethnic enclaves rather than speaking to the larger society. The other problem with the Muslim community in the United States, and what contributes to the spread of Islamophobia, is that the Muslims in the United States are very diverse, both in language and culture. Islam, of course, as a religion, which we've talked about in other videos, is very diverse. And the Muslim community in the United States is also very diverse, both in language and culture. The Muslim immigrants in the United States, they tend to interact with each other rather than with other Muslim communities. So, the Pakistanis have their own mosque and their own little Islamic centers in their city or wherever they live. And then the Lebanese have their own, and the Indians have their own mosque, et cetera, et cetera. The Afghans have their own mosque. So they all tend to be isolated from each other. So it's difficult even to talk about one Muslim community in the United States, because honestly, it's so fractured and so diverse that you really can't say that you have any type of a united or unified Muslim community in the United States. because of language, culture, and also differences, of course, in their interpretations of Islam, and all of those things contribute to a very fractured Muslim community in the United States. Getting to the solution, that's always the part where people tend to turn their volume down on their on the video. People are busy. Most people don't have time to go out and actively, fight against Islamophobia. It's very difficult, even if you wanted to, try getting appearance on any major news program. And unless you're already famous for something else, or there's some reason, they're not just going to invite, your average Muslim off the street onto their TV program and let them talk to millions of people. They still have to sell advertising. Most Muslims can't afford to run for political office. It's extremely expensive, obviously, and you have to have a network. So it's really not that easy, or to start your own TV station or your own media organization. I mean, Muslims have tried it before, but it's very expensive. It takes a lot of effort to do those kind of things. So we're not saying that you have to do something like that in order to fight against Islamophobia. There's pretty simple things that we can do that will hopefully reduce it. One of the most important things is just to vote in elections. So obviously this upcoming election is really important. There's a lot at stake for Muslims, as most Muslims know, and for non-Muslims both, but especially for Muslims. So that could be one of the reasons why, in a recent time poll, 74% of Muslims are actually planning on voting in the upcoming election, which is very good. That could have a big effect, actually. If almost 3 million people vote, additional people vote that haven't voted before, or maybe even if 1 million or 500,000, vote that haven't voted in previous elections, then that could be important, in the election. So just generally participating in the politics of your country by voting. Also, and I've seen it a lot in the area where I live in Dearborn, but you don't see it very often in other parts of the United States, that Muslims are beginning to run for local political office. So, judges, county commissioner, the mayor, those types of offices that are relatively easy to get into. Relatively, I mean, I'm not planning on running for any local political office anytime soon, but for some people, it's something feasible. So doing those kind of things, is also important. Of course, we need more Muslim media organizations. We need more media, of course, in the United States focused on Islam and basically presenting Islam in a true and correct way. Basically, Muslim-created media that presents Islam in an authentic and in a true way is something that we need, which is obviously the focus of Migration 313, which this video is being produced by. And that's one of what we're trying to do. That's the way we're trying to contribute, is through creating media like this to kind of educate both Muslims and non-Muslims on Islam. So that's really important. But probably the most important thing, I think, in my opinion, is to have more unity among the Muslims in the United States. If the Muslims in the United States, even though they're a relatively small number, if they can speak with one voice and act together, they can accomplish things. It is possible. But when Muslims among themselves are very separated and they're not united, then of course it becomes almost impossible to make any type of difference in the overall society. So the primary, I think, prescription for fighting against Islamophobia in the United States is for Muslims to unite together, to become united and to work together for a common purpose. Assalamu alaikum.